Warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am in a slightly different location to normal. Those of you who have attended a few of these sessions before might recognize I'm actually on holiday in Ibiza at the moment, but we decided to go ahead with the webinar today as it's quite an important topic and becoming increasingly urgent, I think, that we all get ready for the economic headwinds that are potentially on their way. So today, as Adam said, we'll talk about how you can use account management to unlock account potential as a very important tool to survive and thrive through stagflation. For those of you who are not familiar with Imparta, we're a global training business, very happy to be recognized by Gartner recently as one of 4 leaders in their Magic Quadrant for the sales training industry. And we cover a whole range of sales disciplines and customer experience as well. And so the topics I'm going to cover today, I thought it would be worth just spending a bit of time at the beginning talking about the economic outlook and just kind of where we are, where we seem to be globally, and with a bit of a focus on the UK and the US and Europe as well. And then move on to say, how do we unlock account potential, and why is that such an important thing to do at a time when markets are starting to rumble and buyers are kind of maybe scaling back on some of the things they would otherwise have put in place. At that point, we'll then talk about just a sample of some of the quick wins, I think, that are available to you as you think about account management inside your organization. And then finally, we'll finish off with just a little bit on how you lead account management. If you are either an account manager, but particularly if you're a sales manager or a chief sales officer, chief revenue officer, how do you get your teams more broadly to think about account management in an insightful and influential way? So those are our 4 topics. It'll be a fairly interactive conversation today, as always. We'll use Slido to get some input from you guys, but also normally I have 3 screens and a proper camera and everything. I'm just on a laptop today. So Adam is going to be looking after the chat for me and will tell me if anybody has any questions. I'm really happy to take questions in the flow of the conversation as well as at the end. So let's start with a bit of what's happening in the economic outlook. Now, you guys read the papers as much as I do. I just thought it might be worth talking about stagflation in particular and why it might be about to happen and why it's such a threat. If you look at some of the views on what's happening this year, it is certainly true that expectations about both inflation and GDP growth have worsened considerably over the last, let's say, kind of year and a bit. So what this graph shows in the blue line is GDP growth forecast and the red line is inflation forecast. Now this is all for 2022, but this shows how expectations have changed. So in January 21, people thought inflation would be, for 2022, would be 2%, and now they're thinking it's going to be 7%, and that's even going up. This only goes up to April. It would be considerably higher now, maybe as much as 8 or 9%. So globally, and especially in the UK, inflation is a big issue. Now, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, why is that inflation happening? And obviously, there is a degree of, and we'll talk about this in a second, there's a degree of demand pull inflation because people are unlocking after the pandemic and they're starting to spend money again. But obviously, because of the war in Ukraine and other supply chain factors, increasing lockdowns in China again, there are other things that are primarily driving inflation up. So this is kind of across different regions. So US, there's quite a bit of energy-based inflation, food-based inflation. The kind of beige bit at the top of the US is actually the result of some of the quantitative easing and the fiscal stimulus that's been applied to the economy through the pandemic, which obviously can exert inflationary pressures as well. In Europe, it is largely inflation driven by energy prices and food prices. Same in other advanced economies. China's a balanced one, and emerging and developing economies a little bit more balanced in terms of quantitative measures as well. So it's not a clear picture on inflation that it's all about demand based inflation, demand pull inflation. There's quite a bit in every region of the world of supply push inflation as well. So if we then look at wage inflation, which is kind of the third element of that, this is the US data on wage inflation, and that also has been relatively low for the last decade, and is now at pretty much an all-time high. And we're starting to see labour disruption in the UK and the US and across Europe as well. And that obviously feeds into some of the supply issues that are driving up prices by restricting supply. So the last part of this is looking at economic growth. And if I look at Euromonitor's figures here, they give a range of possible outcomes for real GDP growth in basically the Eurozone this covers. So as you can see, in the pessimistic case, the Eurozone will enter a recession. If there's global stagflation, the Eurozone is likely to enter a recession as well. There are some scenarios where it doesn't, which is good news. But at the moment, a recession does seem like it's quite possible. And the way these things I've talked about interact is very important to understand. So if we think about the things that drive inflation, you have supply constraints because of the pandemic, disruptions to logistics and supply chains, war and labor disruption now. Then you have increasing wages, partly because of the pandemic, which has taken quite a lot of people out of the labor market, but also labor market friction. So you have oversupply in labor in some parts of the market and undersupply in others. And then there's kind of high demand pull inflation, which is, again, largely down to pandemic easing and therefore demand unlocking. But it's also because governments have taken steps to try and keep their economies growing through the pandemic and after. Now, all three of those drive increasing prices, and there is a feedback loop between prices and wages, obviously, because as prices go up, people want their salaries to keep up with the cost of living, and therefore there's increasing pressure to increase wages, which does create a bit of a vicious cycle between prices and wages. So that's kind of one of the main problems we've got, is those things are happening. Now, when you ask yourself, what can governments do to try and keep inflation down while growing the economy, there are sadly relatively few tools to do that. So one of the obvious things that most governments are doing right now is raising, or central banks, I should say, is raising interest rates, which is a way of dampening down demand-based inflation, and fiscal tightening. So, spending less, reducing the supply of money, which is also a way of dampening demand-based inflation. So what happens is demand is going to fall, but the other two factors, wage inflation and especially supply push inflation, haven't really gone away. So unless we can resolve those things, or demand falls to the point where it's now at the right level relative to those newly low levels of supply, then we have this problem where prices keep increasing and demand is falling, GDP is falling. And that is what's called stagflation, as you know, stagnation and inflation. I remember it in the 70s, some of you will do as well, and it wasn't a pleasant experience, it must be said. So I think that is the risk, that we get into a position where prices keep going up, but all of the tools that people can use to keep prices down actually will just make the recession worse and therefore aren't very effective. Now, there are ways out of stagflation. The person who came up with the term stagflation actually also defined ways to deal with stagflation that have to do with very, very selective tax cuts in specific areas and a particular style of monetary control. But that's not what this is about. This is about saying, if it happens, how can we in the sales community respond in a way that protects our businesses and allows us to keep growing even through those headwinds? So it's useful to think about how customers make their buying decisions and how those decisions change or would change if stagflation happens. And those of you who know Imparta know that we tend to be very customer-centric and think about the customer's buying cycle rather than a sales process. So the buying cycle starts with need. This is where the customer decides that they want to move away from the status quo and do something differently, make a new purchase, whatever. Choose is where they decide which of the potential solutions they've identified they're going to go with. Then worry is about where they decide, is this actually worth doing? What could go wrong at a strategic level, tactically, but also individually for them? And if they make it through that kind of risk alleviation process, then they start to commit, and the organization coalesces behind the deal, and you get the negotiation as well. Then there's an adoption process, and ultimately a renewal, if it's that kind of product or service, or an expansion even of your relationship with the customer. So under stagflation, things happen at each of those stages of the buying cycle. So in the need stage, obviously needs change because the nature, the dynamics of the customer's market are changing really rapidly, but also priorities change. And with lots of other calls on cash and rapidly increasing prices, it's actually harder for you as a sales organization to create value for your customers. In the choose phase, decision criteria change quite a lot. So, for example, the balance between OPEX and CAPEX might because of the time value of money, which I'll come back to, might be a really big factor where it wasn't a year ago. And the timing of payments, the resilience of the supplier might suddenly be really important decision criteria when choosing a supplier, where again, they may not have been 3 or 4 years ago. At the worry stage, the risks that stagflation create for customers are different, but also the risk appetite generally will go down. There's enough going on, and customers are maybe less willing to take on additional risks. There'll be less, shall we say, speculative investment in solutions that are not absolutely proven and tested. In the commit stage, the negotiation process will probably get a lot tougher, procurement having even greater say in that process, but also the hurdle rates for an investment will almost certainly go up. And that's because when companies invest in a new product or a service, obviously they're using up capital to do that. And that capital has a cost, even if it's cash sitting in the bank. The shareholders expect there to be a return on that investment, or if it's funded by debt, there's interest to pay on that debt. So there is a cost of capital known as the weighted average cost of capital for those who are familiar with that. And basically, any investment has to provide a return that is at least as big as that cost of capital in order to generate value for the customer's business. So that hurdle goes up as interest rates go up and as the cost of capital goes up. Then in the adopt and renew, it's always been important to demonstrate ROI when you're talking to a customer, but now in this environment, it becomes even more important and really critical to be able to show that the work you've done actually has generated value and a return on investment that's above the cost of capital and will continue to do so. So changes at each stage of the buying cycle in this kind of scenario. And also, as we saw through the pandemic, when there's pressure on executive teams especially, it's quite often the case that buying processes slow down and more people need to get involved in order to alleviate risk. So expect things to take a bit longer to happen. So I'm going to ask you a question now, because one of the reasons we're talking about account management today is that a lot of these things are actually easier to manage for an existing account than for a new business opportunity. So I'm going to ask you, within the context of your business, which of those issues that we've just talked about have you already seen as a result of the macroeconomic issues that are going on? So if you take your camera on your phone and point it at that QR code on the bottom left, that should bring you to a page on an app called Slido. You don't have to install the app, it's just on a web browser. And on there, anonymously, you can put in which of these factors you've seen already, and you can choose more than one as a result of the macroeconomic issues that we're seeing. It'd be useful to understand kind of what people are seeing out there and which are the biggest factors. So I think there's a question that's come in, Adam, if you could just read that out while we watch those while we watch those numbers change on the slide.
Sure, that was the link going in for Slido. So if
brilliant.
you
Sorry,
go on your phone, you can follow that link, enter the code, and it will bring the platform up in front of you there.
Thanks, Adam. This is why multiple screens is such a good idea. So over half of you are saying demonstrating ROI becomes even more important. Half risk appetite changes, needs and priorities change, decision criteria change. Fewer are saying the hurdle rates have increased for investment yet. But it's interesting to see, that kind of economic headwind is still really in the early stages. And already we're seeing that showing ROI is even more important than it was before. Needs and priorities are changing and the risk appetite is changing. So I guess that kind of, if you're experiencing that, then that validates your experience. You're not alone in this. This is happening pretty much everywhere right now. Good. Thank you very much for your contribution to that. And we will, there'll be a recording of this available on our website. Adam will send a link to you. And we'll actually include, I think, the poll results as well, because it's kind of interesting to see the experience that everybody is having. So there is one other issue. I said that those factors are easier to manage within an existing account than they are on new business. But there is one other big issue here that makes it especially important for you guys to focus on account management. Obviously, still do new business dev, but account management is going to become super important to preserving your business over the next year or so. And that reason is status quo bias. So status quo bias means people inherently prefer to stick with a supplier, well, to stay with the status quo. But in our context, it means to stick with the supplier they're currently with, the solution they're currently with, and generally not to change. And status quo bias is a psychological effect that happens in decision-making groups. And it's been quite well studied. And there are 4 main reasons that status quo bias exists. Psychological inertia, so it's just easier not to change. Loss aversion, which means that people feel the effects of a loss more than they do the effects of a gain. And in the context of change, people anticipate loss or regret by making the wrong decision. And the fear of that loss tends to make them stick with how things are right now. The third effect is something called the endowment effect. That means that somebody values something more if they already own it. And therefore, because they already own the solution they have right now, they actually value it more than something they don't own. Interesting effect. Originally demonstrated with chocolate bars, but it actually applies to a whole range of products and services as well. And then finally, there's just decision costs and uncertainty. You don't necessarily know what's going to happen, and therefore it becomes more difficult to make a decision to switch to a different way of doing things. And because of all of the risk factors and the increased hurdle rates and everything else, the costs of actually making a decision to change also go up. So what happens as we come into this period of stagflation and uncertainty, and we talked in the last webinar about forecasting under uncertainty and in a more VUCA world, and it certainly in a sense, uncertainty has actually gone down a bit. It's becoming more certain that this will happen, but it's still a pretty uncertain world. So what happens is the status quo bias becomes even more effective. It's like a ball and a chain around the ankles of your customers. Psychological inertia goes up as the general threat level goes up. Loss aversion becomes more significant because there's potentially more that can go wrong. Endowment effect doesn't change too much, but certainly decision costs go up, as I explained, and so does uncertainty. And all that means is it's harder to win new business during a recession. That's actually not quite right. It may not be harder to win new business, but there's just less new business out there to be won because people are tending more to stick with what they know. So because of that, it's important to think about account management and to grow, and especially to renew the accounts that you already have in order to protect and grow your business. So that's basically where this webinar comes in. So the first kind of, or the second section, but the first bit of stuff around account management is how do we unlock the potential of all of the accounts that we have? And just to put this in perspective, this diagram that you're seeing here is our curriculum, at least the core curriculum around the buying cycle for the sales area. We have another one in customer experience. And you'll see around the outside, there's an advanced layer, there's a core layer, and a management and leadership layer. The account management course that I'll be talking about here is in that top left-hand corner. So this is one of the courses, and it's modular. So there are about 12 modules, I think, in the account management program. People who are subscribers to our training as a service model have access to the whole curriculum at any time, whether that's as e-learning, face-to-face learning, virtual instructor-led training, and the account management course that I'll be drawing a few ideas from today is one of those programs. So let's talk about account plans. Whether you have a small account, lots of small accounts, or a large account, there's an interesting balance between how much information an account plan holds, so raw data like what we've done already with that customer, what the feedback was, contact notes from the meetings you've had, extracts from their website and their annual report, what are the current opportunities we're pursuing, and especially things like a SWOT analysis that's data but no deduction, no insight coming out of that analysis. On the other hand, an insightful account plan is really all about answering the key questions that we need to know in order to unlock the potential of the account. So where are we strong and weak in the account? What's the potential? Where should I focus? What's changing? How can we add value? Which relationships should we build and leverage, and how should we do that? So in my mind, boiling the ocean dry with lots of data is not really an account plan. An account plan is figuring out what the key questions are and then answering those questions, and really only those questions, right? Focusing so that you're more efficient and have time to create an account plan, even for a very small account. So I'm actually going to ask you just to rate yourselves now. And again, this is anonymous, so this won't come back to you other than in genericized form. How much insight is there in your account plans today? So 0 is it's all information and really no insight. 10 is it's incredibly deep insight that's very powerful in helping us to drive and to grow and to protect our accounts. So just think about your colleagues, your business as a whole. How much insight is there in your account plans? You can point your camera at that QR code again, but if you just go back to the web browser on your phone, this new poll should be open for you. So it's something like a reasonably nice normal distribution there, slightly skewed. But the kind of, I'd say we're looking about sort of 7 is the peak of that, but a pretty long tail of people with not a lot of insight, and nobody is claiming a 10, which is probably right. I'm not sure I've ever seen a 10 in terms of account plans. So I guess, if you're in that 7 or 8 or 9 category, then good for you. And I'm sure you're in a business that's doing very well. There's always room for improvement. If you're in the kind of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 range, then my suggestion would be that if you can, try to shift the focus of your account planning process and account management process away from just reporting on what's happening and towards insightful planning of what you need to do, then that will have a strong impact. So the average is 5.7 there, which is consistent with our experience in clients, but as I say, gives plenty of room for improvement. So what are the questions that we should be asking? Well, if you know Imparta, you'll know that one of our kind of key ideas is this thing called the 3D advantage that says underpinning almost any skill in sales or account management are 3 dimensions: insight, influence, and trust. And they work in new business development. They also work in account management. So insight is being able to create value through insights into the customer's evolving needs and the possible solutions to those needs, and into how best you can protect and expand the account. Influence is about getting the people in the account, the stakeholders, to act, to do the things that you want and that you think will be in their interests, through the ethical use of psychology and behavioral science. And if you have insight and influence, you're getting towards being an effective account manager, but you are still missing the third dimension, which is trust. And trust is what gives you access to senior stakeholders in order to do the other two things. Trust is about building relationships through credibility, reliability, intimacy with the customer, and focusing on their agenda rather than yours when you're speaking to them. Now, we have an interesting little way of thinking about different types of account manager. In the program, there's a way of assessing yourself against these dimensions. Somebody who is just insightful is an educator. They're somebody who, is happy to explain things to the customer, but doesn't really get them to change their behavior or to adopt new practices. Somebody who's insightful and influential is a disruptor, and that can be good, but can be quite limited in time, because without trust, those disruptions don't last very long. Influential only is somebody who's a driver. They'll drive change, but it's not value creating necessarily, because it's lacking insight. Somebody who's trusted and influential is somebody who can execute a plan very well, even if it's not a very insightful plan. Trust alone makes you a helper. Trust plus insight makes you a consultant, but you're not getting people to change, so you're not really a salesperson. If you're none of those things, you're an avoider, and if you're all three of them, you're a 3D account manager. So whenever you think about any skill in pretty much any form of sales, think about, how do I bring insight to the situation? How do I influence the right behavior? And how do I maintain and build trust? So how does that kind of flow through? Well, insight in the context of account management is really about strategy. It's about what is your account plan supposed to achieve. And when we talk about strategy, there are three dimensions of strategy that are very useful when you're thinking about a business, that also work for account management, even if it's a very small account. Now, the first is where to compete. Where in this account should I be competing for business? And correspondingly, where not? So which buying centers do I want to target within the account? And with which products and service categories that I offer, which are the ones that are going to be the most effective for this account, and in which buying centers? So choosing where to pursue the business and correspondingly where not to is a very important part of account planning. And that will basically be, down to some extent to how attractive the opportunities are. So maybe those two squares in the middle are relatively attractive buying centers and relatively attractive products and services. But there's a second element, which is how to compete. So how can we improve our performance and our competitive advantage inside the account? So that is down to things like, how well does our product perform, but also how well do we know the stakeholders? How influential are we in the account? How profitable can we make the account so we can discount prices if we have to, and so on. And essentially, there are different mappings between your how to compete strengths and the where to compete areas. So you want something that is an attractive piece of business to go for, but also that's achievable for you. So the red in this one is attractive but not achievable, and the green square is attractive and achievable. And then the third dimension is when to compete. In what order should we do things, basically, within the account? And so those, a very simple framework as it is, those three things, where to compete, how to compete, and when to compete, give us a framework for proper account management. And essentially, if I kind of spread this out, there are three phases that we have to consider. So the first phase is planning, then there's doing, and then there's reviewing. And quite often that process goes wrong in different ways. So planning is often, as I've said, just reporting, not real planning. Doing may not be clear on priorities, and reviewing is often not done deeply or frequently enough. So if I combine the plan, do, review cycle with the strategy framework, here is our kind of account management process. So it begins with mapping the account and creating a strategic vision, which sounds very grand, but is really simply a statement of where I want to be in the account and where I don't want to be. Then we tackle how to compete and where to compete separately. So how to compete is about how do I strengthen partnerships, performance, profitability, people, and politics. You'll notice the P's here. And in where to compete, what are the pressures on the account and what potential opportunities does that give me to create value? So there are 7 P's there that together create your sort of strategic bedrock. Then we get into when to compete. So those other pieces will give us a huge list of potential actions we could take to improve business in the account. We have to prioritize those and plan in the actions. Then there's an implementation phase, the do section, which is about building trust, influencing delivery against the plan, even without authority, and bringing insight to forecasting. And finally, in the review section, it's about reviewing progress on a continual basis and adjusting the plan as needed. And then that loops back to the beginning. So what I'll do today is just talk about a couple of quick wins. Obviously, this is a much bigger sort of program and there are quite a few skills in here, but just to give you a few things that you can take away and use to improve your account management over the next week and month. So here is a summary of some quick account management wins. And we'll begin with mapping the activity in your account. So when you do this, one of the ways to do it is to think about the independent buying centers within the account. So which are the budget holders that operate independently, and what are the relevant products and service categories that you could sell into those? Now that may also go beyond the bit of the organization that you're selling to right now. So if you're selling to, a daughter company of a wider conglomerate, maybe you can think about buying centers that are at the parent organization or in sister companies. But for each of those squares, between a buying center and a product service category, there are 4 questions that it's really useful to ask yourself. What did we sell last year in that square? What will we sell this year? What could we sell? And how are we perceived? And those 4 things tell you kind of your competitive advantage in each square and what the trends are and what your share of wallet is, and therefore tells you what the big opportunities and also threats are for you inside that account. So this is a tool called the Account Gameboard that does just that. Down the left-hand side, we have product service categories, and then the 4 different things: spend last year, this year, addressable spend, and customer health. So we fill this in at the top with the different buying center names. We fill in the product service categories, then kind of what are the different numbers as best we can. You won't know all the numbers, but that's cool. That tells you what you need to find out, and then a total at the end. Now, to explain why this is helpful, I'm just going to talk through 4 little scenarios very quickly that will show you, I think, the power of this way of looking at the data. So here is a square of the game board. Product category A and independent buying center is business unit 1. So in this particular part of the customer, we sold $200,000 last year, $100,000 this year, and the addressable spend is $200,000. And the customer health score, which is in effect our performance, is moderate. So what's that telling you? Just have a think about that for a second, and then I'll explain what it is saying. What do you think that might be telling you? So clearly, revenue's gone down. We're now at 50% of addressable spend, and customer health is not great, it's only moderate. So this, as hopefully you could see, is a risk. That one, sorry, I've just gone forward too much. That is an area where we need to really understand why our revenue has gone down. Perhaps another entrant has managed to displace us, which could be an ongoing threat, especially if customer health is still only moderate. So we need to understand what's happened and potentially to change our strategy and find new ways to create value, because that looks like a very dangerous situation to me. Okay, scenario 2. So we are 200K this year, and we've basically got all of the addressable spend. So our share of wallet is pretty much 100%, and customer health is poor. Well, clearly, this is still, for some reason, hanging on in there, but it looks very much under threat because customer health is so poor. It could be, in this scenario, that we've got that revenue because it's associated with another project we're doing, and this is really just kind of tangential revenue. But I would again be very worried looking at that and go, we need to address the issues around customer health right away, or that revenue is going to be under threat next year. So this is basically an early warning system, an advanced warning of where things might go wrong. The third scenario, so we've got only 10,000 last year, only 10,000 this year, 200K addressable spend again, and a good level of customer health. So what's that telling you? Clearly, there's an opportunity. This may be an area we haven't really gone after. Customer health is pretty good for that small amount of business we're doing. So here is an opportunity to really grow the account. And the fourth scenario, we've increased quite a bit from 50K to 150K. Addressable spend is 200 and customer health is moderate. Here, our strategy should be to consolidate. We've made significant gains in revenue and share of wallet, but unless we actually consolidate those gains and show that we can deliver the value we've promised, they may be quite short-lived. So if I pull back, there are basically 5 generic strategies that you can apply to each independent buying center in an account. And if it's a small account, there may only be one buying center. It might just be, a single thing. And the 5 strategies are: consolidate your position to deliver against recent new wins or address any issues with performance; grow where customer health is good by finding and winning new opportunities; change your value proposition to move away from areas that you're weak on and avoid commoditization; hold your position if you have a good share of wallet and customer health is good; or maybe divest resources, reduce the time you spend, perhaps because you're not winning because the account is too small to be profitable, or it's too transactional and margins are being driven down, or their needs have changed and they don't fit what you can offer anymore. So really, it's about thinking about the different chunks of business within an account and going, which of these do I want to go for? Which of these do I need to consolidate my position, change my value proposition, hold, or move away from? And that really is the beginning part of your account strategy. So let's look at how to compete, which is about your advantages inside the account. And the first thing to think about is, how much of a partnership do you have with that account? Think about the investment by the supplier in the partnership up the left-hand side by you, and the investment by the customer in the partnership along the bottom. And this is adapted from a great book called Rethinking the Salesforce by Neil Rackham and John DeVincentis. And basically, if you think about the different levels of investment on both sides, you have sort of e-channels at the bottom, transactional and tele-account management, consultative account management, strategic account management, and enterprise account management at the top. And the thing to make sure that you're not doing is that you're under or over investing relative to the customer. So if you're over investing, it's wasteful on the top top left there. And if you're under investing in the bottom right, it's risky because they are looking for a deeper relationship and might go elsewhere. So match your level of partnership and your investment in that relationship to what the customer is doing as well. Then think about performance. And so we've talked about customer health a few times. It's worth remembering that there are 2 types of customer health. And if you're not currently tracking both types of metric, then maybe you should think about doing that. The most obvious thing to look at is results. So adoption of your solution, some other key performance indicators for training, it's what new revenue are people generating, for example. What's the impact on cost or whatever it is you're trying to achieve? What's the ROI? But it's also worth thinking about the customer's experience. That's essential in customer health. So how good is the solution fitting their current needs? How much effort are they having to put in with the customer effort score? What's their customer satisfaction? What's their net promoter score? So when you're thinking about the threats and opportunities in the account, think about customer health more broadly than just looking at results, and instead include the customer experience. And often you can do more in the short term to improve the customer experience than you can results. Think about account profitability. So much as a business has a P&L that starts with revenue, you take off the cost of sales, the variable costs, to give you gross profit. And then from the gross profit, you deduct the fixed costs or the indirect costs to give you operating profit. So the same thing happens in an account, right? You can create an estimate of an account's operating profit. And these things have different levers. So revenue is driven by price and volume. Maybe there are things you can do to change the balance there and improve overall revenue. Variable costs are affected by cost control, but also by the mix of products and services that you're selling in. So maybe you could cross-sell or upsell or put in a substitute product that has a better margin. Maybe your fixed account costs are being affected by the account team structure, so the cost of account management, the cost of sales time, and so on. And that could be driven by the customer. Maybe the customer has suddenly said, instead of doing a single invoice to a central unit, you have to do 20 invoices to each country, and that kind of thing can have a big impact on account profitability. So taking a proactive approach to account profitability can be very powerful. Then think about relationships inside the account. So here is an example where we're looking at customer stakeholders on the left-hand side and your account team across the top. So the most influential customer is at the top left, and your most influential account team member, the exec sponsor, is on the left as well. And so what we've done here is mapped out how good each relationship is. Is it a trusted advisor relationship in green, a good relationship, limited contact, which is blank, or an actively bad relationship in red there? And you can look at this kind of analysis, this matrix, and go, well, there's some problems here. So that single senior sponsor, number one, is very, very influential. But what happens if they leave? What happens if they, there's cost reduction at the customer and they get kicked out or they move to another division? Because suddenly we don't have enough strength in depth in our relationships, and that makes us vulnerable. So think about where you have single points of contact and the risks that gives you, and try and actively find relationships with other stakeholders. Here is another senior person that we hardly know, so that's a risk as well. And we've got a pretty mixed relationship with number three. So can that be fixed, or can we somehow avoid contact between B and 3? Looking at our account team, we're very reliant on quite a junior member of the team here. What happens if they leave? So you've always got to think about, in relationships with customers, the account manager is sort of the conductor of the orchestra, and they need to be aware of who knows whom. You don't have to have the relationship yourself, but you need to make sure that every customer who's important is marked by somebody on the account team side. And then there's the politics of stakeholders. So it's worth thinking about the customer stakeholders and the influence they have over the decisions that affect you as a supplier, and also how aligned they are towards you. So are they for you or generally against you? Somebody who is for you and very influential is a champion. And our goal here is to protect and leverage those people. Somebody who's influential but is against you is a nemesis, and we've got to find ways to convert them to being on your side or to circumvent them. If it's a weak opponent or a weak supporter, there are different things we can do. So you can basically plot your stakeholders on this grid, the stakeholder map, and then find ways to strengthen your champions by making sure that they are kept up to date with what's going on. They have the data they need, the insight they need, and so on. You can improve the influence level of your weaker supporters by, for example, finding opportunities for them to speak and coaching them so that they're seen as more influential by their immediate bosses and stakeholders. The nemesis, you may be able to reduce their level of influence relative to other people, perhaps by bringing in somebody else who actually is also influential, who's a supporter, or you might be able to understand why they're not supportive of you and actually take action to move them to the right on this grid. So this is quite a useful tool, the stakeholder map, for thinking about what's going on with your stakeholders and developing ideas and strategies which you can then execute in order to change that map. So that's kind of how to compete. In the interest of time, I'm going to whiz through where to compete very, very quickly. So where to compete really is about what are the shocks that are happening in the customer's industry, the pastel shocks: political, economic, social, technological, environmental, legal. And then what effect do those shocks have on the customer's own company, its competitors, its channels, and its customers? And all of those things you can sort of create insight into using a tool that we call the value chain. So the value chain is a way of capturing the customer's objectives and then asking yourself, which of these objectives can we help with? And that lets you generate opportunities. So objectives basically are unmet objectives, are needs, and they come into three different categories: key performance indicators, challenges, and wider goals. And by thinking about that for different departments inside the customer, and trying to quantify what their KPIs are, what the challenges are creating for them, and what their wider goals are, you can actually identify opportunities that you can then potentially pursue. And remember to include objectives that have been created by those macroeconomic pressures, by the resignation pressures, by all the things going on right now, and so that you're providing insight to the customers about what they need to work on. Then when you've identified a whole bunch of actions in the how to compete space and potential opportunities, then we have to prioritize. So here is a very similar grid to the other one, but this time we're looking at the impact of each idea and how achievable it is. So the impact from low to high and achievability from low to high. And again, you can plot all of the different objectives you have for an account. And obviously, if something is highly achievable and has a high impact, you go for it. And you reject the things like objective 2 that are relatively low impact and low achievability. But if you have something that's achievable, but not very high impact, you might cherry pick a few of those to work on. And if you have some things like objective 1 here that are hard to achieve, but quite high impact, you can go for those, you can put effort into them, but recognize you can't do too many. You're sort of placing your bets on one or at most 2 of those ideas. So this is about trying to understand, what your priorities should be. And then when it comes to implementing, I just want to say that often as an account manager, you have to influence without authority. And there's a spectrum of different tools that people can use to do that, from push to negotiation to pull. We all tend to use one set of tools, and it's worth thinking about whether you can try a different set of tools, right? So push forms of influence are asserting, demanding, explaining, justifying. So this is talking to your internal account team as they work with the customer. On the other hand, you've got pull influence, which is building coalitions, building consensus between your internal stakeholders, consulting with them to try and figure out what's best for them, or even selling, right? Selling into what they need as a team or individually, and trying to get them to see that what you need is actually the same as what they need. And in the middle are the approaches of negotiation. So building relationships, exploring what they want to happen, trading off between the things you want and the things they want, and triggering reciprocity, which is where you basically go, if I do this, would you do that? So my advice when it comes to, especially under pressure, as things get tougher, is try not to just always fall back on the same influencing tools that typically might be push, but instead explore whether you can use pull, negotiation, or even negotiation with your teams to get things to happen. There's a bit more here on coordinating the account team and Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team, which I'm not going to have time to go through today, but if you have a chance to look at this program, you'll see these. But it's basically about saying, think about where teams go wrong, account teams go wrong. And if you Google Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions, we've added a 6th, which is lack of connection, especially important in these days of hybrid working. But making sure that if you see any of these things happen, you take account of those. And there are some tools that we would give you that kind of help you to think about how to do things like tracking activity, and making sure you're looking at leading activities as well as lagging activities. So apologize for that being a bit cut short. But the last thing I want to just touch on is reviewing. So reviewing is going to be very important as we come into these economic headwinds, because when you make a change, whether that's an account plan and a set of actions that come out of it, those things will often give you a spike in performance on the account. But over time, that performance will fade away because the plans may not be implemented well, what the customer needs might change, the stakeholders might change, as we said, their priorities might change, and it may well be that some of the things you've done don't work. So it's very important as an account manager, or if you're leading a bunch of account managers, to make sure that people spend time constantly refreshing this and getting back involved on a very regular basis with smaller ad hoc and informal reviews of specific issues to keep performance high. So you're sort of pushing the curve up with ongoing implementations and ongoing interventions, and of course, regular formal reviews with the account team as well. One useful psychological tool to help you with this is called the question behavior effect. And this says that asking a question about something you want people to do actually encourages them to take that action. So if you say to a member of your account team, have you uncovered the customer's decision criteria? What that does is creates in their mind a mental model of ideal behavior. And if they're not doing that at the moment, if their current behavior is not ideal, it creates cognitive dissonance between that mental model of what they should be doing and what they are doing. And that actually tends to drive the desired behavior. So it's important to engage the account team on a regular basis, to review on a regular basis, and to ask questions every time you do about the things you want them to be doing, because that will make them more likely to take the right actions. Renewal, I think, is going to be challenging as we go into this. And it's worth thinking that when customers decide to renew, they go through a really quick version of the buying cycle that I talked about at the beginning. So the things that can make a customer not renew are worth being aware of. And it might be that their needs are not being met, or they've changed, the criteria have changed, there are new risks being perceived and so on, or maybe your pricing is now seen as high relative to benefits, or they just want to renegotiate. But be aware that there are lots of reasons why renewals may not happen, and think about the customer's journey as they renew as a very rapid version of this buying cycle. So that's just a few ideas. I mean, there's a lot more stuff in there that we could talk about, but in the time, I hope that at least one or two of those might give you a thought that when you go back to your desk, you're like, oh, maybe we should think about doing that. And this recording will be available to refresh your memory. Just a quick thing about if you are a leader of account managers, it's worth thinking about skill and will of your account managers. So to do all of that stuff well takes both skill and motivation, and understanding where somebody is on those two dimensions is very helpful to know what kind of thing you need to be doing. So do you need to focus on an account manager's motivation, or on sort of guiding them on how to do a particular skill? But we found there's a third dimension to this, always three dimensions, which is way. So skill, will, and way. And way is all about resourcing. So somebody might have the ability, the skill to do something, and the motivation or the will to do it, but no way to do it because they're lacking maybe the technology, or maybe the data, or funding, or resources, or insight to be able to take the actions to defend an account. So as a leader, you want to be aware of that as well, and recognize that you might need to counsel and support account managers as they struggle with some of the bigger issues, to give them the way to resolve the issues that they see. It's also worth thinking about the different types of activity you can do to get people to improve. Again, we're slightly out of time, so I won't go through this in full detail, but there are tensions between standardized approaches when you do training and individual needs, and also between your talent strategy as an organization and the commercial strategy of the business. And there are different types of use case for learning that will help with each of those things. So you've got training to help with courses and career pathways, campaigns to focus on specific issues in your market, contextual learning, so I've got a particular problem, how do I deal with that? And also competency development. So I know I need to get better at account planning, how do I do that? And then curiosity and coaching draw people between those different use cases. Now, you can do this kind of use case scenario with any type of learning, but we've built tools to help with that, obviously. And one of our new releases is Salesforce integration. So our tools are now CCV, our opportunity management program. We will very shortly be able to give you tools in Salesforce, and the account management program is the next one that we're building native Salesforce tools for.